Okay guys, reassembly time. I took all the parts and pieces out of my valve assembly, put a little lube on them, put them back in. The little plastic piece that's in here has a tapered edge that goes towards this side of the valve, and then your spring is behind that. There's an O-ring where the two pieces come together, so you want to give that a little bit of lube to help it seal. Maybe like a diver's grease or something like that. Same thing with this O-ring and this O-ring. And in here, I put a little bit of pellet oil, just to help the seals function a little better. This next piece mates up with your valve assembly. And you should notice there's a hole. This is your transfer port. Okay, that's offset. And on this one, I want it closer to the valve system. I also want to put it opposite this threaded portion of the valve assembly. Okay, so this points down for this stud to screw into, and 180 degrees, your transfer port will point up. So I'm going to put this back in the gun, basically the same way I took it out. We'll slide it up there as far as we can. And now whatever system you used to take this and smack it out, just gently tap it back in. Okay, once you get it back in place, you may be offset a little bit. Just go ahead and get some way to push it back into place. Gently, you don't want to bugger up the threads. Once that valve is where it needs to be, get this post and screw it in. That way you're set. The same thing on the other side. If your transfer port isn't lined up perfect, get in there and push it around until it's lined up how it needs to be. Okay, after that, this is another directional piece. This is a little donut looking guy. It's got a threaded portion to it, and this little post fits in the middle of it. So we've got our little donut piece in. The threads are on towards the top, and ultimately your breech bolt or screw will end up screwing into this. We don't need to do that right now. The hammer has a taper to it that goes towards the rear, and a little spring portion there, and you just want to line up this hole with the rest. Now this is the part where I had to smack out this this threaded piece, because it's a pressure fit in there. So I'm going to go ahead and put this back in. Like I said in the earlier video, you want the smooth part to go in from the bottom first. Okay? And it will stop, guys. This hole on the top is not large enough for this pin to get through. So once you come to a stopping point with this, don't drive it any further. Just take a look at it, and it's probably where it needs to be. Okay guys, next step is going to basically be to start the reassembly of putting the barrel on and stuff. One thing to note is your transfer port has this little spacer in it. It's like a T-shaped looking spacer. That's going to fit down in that hole first. Just notice my threads are off here. Let me grab that again. Okay, that's going to fit down in that first, and then your transfer port O-ring goes on top of that. So make sure that that's put in the right direction. Then you can put your plastic piece on. Now, another note on this plastic, it's got a taper to the edges. Okay, they come in like that. And also the angles from the top to the bottom are two different angles. One is a more extreme, a tighter curve to it. That side is going to go up against your barrel. The more shallow curve is going to go against the bottom of on your pressure tube. The little finagling, we'll put that in place. All my holes are lined up nicely. Alright, once you've got your barrel in place, tighten down your breech screw. And we might as well put on our trigger assembly. So I'll take your trigger assembly group, and it fits around that pin in the back that we pressed in earlier. Pressed or smacked, however you did it. You'll be holding against, oops, wrong screw. There's a long screw and a thin and a short screw. The long one goes towards the front. Guys, I remember doing this the last time I put this gun together. Putting this trigger assembly back in place can be a real challenge. At least on my rifle it is. So it's going to maybe take a little bit of finagling, a little magic to get this both of these screws to find their threads and go back home. And I'm also working against the spring pressure from the trigger itself. So it can be a little tricky. Don't get frustrated. Take your time with it. You'll get it. Trigger group's back in place. Now we'll go ahead and put our bolt back in. Transfer port on the bolt. I knew there was something I wanted to look at. Transfer port on the bolt. You want to make sure that's pointed down into the gun. Once that's in place, you can screw your old knob back in. Okay, check it for function. Everything works. So that's really good. Alright, where are we now? Oh, this rear plug piece. This rear plug has an indent on the top. If you guys remember, this is where this plastic washer plug piece came in. And we had taken the barrel off and then taken this plug out during disassembly just to make it a little easier to get to. Now during reassembly, it really doesn't matter whether that plug goes in first or last. But it does have to be seated all the way down in there. Now with that plug seated in there, put this long bolt in. Okay, that's snug back down in place. Put our pump handle back in. Oh yeah, one note guys, there's a pin up here at the hinge point. Be careful not to lose that. It can come out pretty easy. It's not really pressed in place or anything. Now I'm just using that as a temporary hinge so I can get this piston back as far as I want it to. I'll take that out. Put in our front plug here. This can be a little tricky too guys because you're lining up these holes with the holes from this piece with the holes from this piece, so it can be a little tedious. And now it's time to push back in the roll pin. Now you can do this with a hammer or a vise, whatever you want, but I found if you mushroomed the edge of your roll pin and you didn't get a new one with your rebuild kit, maybe just take a file to it, just very lightly take those edges off, and that way you can punch it back in there without too much trouble. Now that your roll pin's back in place, do a test on your pump handle. You could have done this a long time ago, but you can pump it up because you basically have a functioning rifle right now. One thing I failed to mention during the rebuild process was this stud here. I just threaded it in to hold the valve assembly in place. You want to make sure to put it in the right way. Mine's been sitting in here upside down there during this whole rebuild. Okay, this larger portion goes up towards the gun. So you want to get that in there, and then you want to tighten it down somehow. Some guys will file edges on the edge of this this big piece here. They'll file edges on either side so that they can get a not one of these, but a crescent wrench, and they can put a crescent wrench on it and just tighten it down really easy. So I'll get that snugged up, and then basically we're going to put the safety back in, sorry, the sights back on, the stock back on, and put the safety back in place, and then we've got a gun, a functioning rifle. At this point, guys, the last thing to do is put the safety back in. It goes in basically the same way it came out. You want to point it downwards or anywhere between down and pointed towards the front. You're going to have to lift up this little pin in here with my screwdriver. You're going to have to lift this guy up and get it out of the spring pressure. So you probably have to come in from the other side, lift it, and then start pushing this through, and it'll snap right back into place. But before I do that, this gun will fire, so I'm going to test it before I put the safety back in, because in taking this apart and putting it back together, I find this to be one of the most difficult parts of this whole process, and I just don't want to have to take it back out if there's anything wrong.